I think, dear to each of our hearts, and something that we need to be concerned about, and that is commitment, dedication, consecration to the Lord, and determination to serve Him no matter what. I like to go back to the Old Testament from time to time and refer back to some of the characters that we see in the Old Testament, because I think many times that their actions and their dedication to God can serve as examples for us with the problems that we have in this day and age in trying to serve God. You know, a lot of times we think that we have a hard time serving God. Oh, it's just really hard to get out on Sunday morning, and it's worse on Sunday night, and Wednesday night sometimes is ridiculous. And that's really all we have to do to serve God, we think, in many cases. But I'd like to go back into the book of Daniel tonight, if you've got your Bibles and would like to turn back there with me. We're going to be talking about 4 men tonight. And we're going to be looking at the type of dedication, the consecration, and the commitment that these men had that we need today in order to stand up for what's right and stand up for God in our determination to serve Him. In chapter 3 of Daniel, we read about the first 3 of these men. We're going to be reading quite a bit tonight, so if you'd care to read along with us, I think it'll make it more meaningful for you. And I'll be reading out of the King James Version. I'm a little bit partial to the King James. Someone said one time they'd like to see them modernize Shakespeare and see how it went over like they tried to do to the Bible. I've been with the King James Version so many years that it's more or less second nature to me, and I don't use the others much except once in a while just for reference. But if you'd like to use them, well, that's fine. Now, Daniel, if you'll remember, the 3 men we're going to talk about first are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, there's a little song about them being cast into the burning fiery furnace. And it sounds a little bit comical at times, and it's humorous. And I guess that's good, but I think we need to stop and take stock of what really took place with those 3 men. How they determined that they were not going to serve anyone except God and Him only. They were not going to back down. They were not going to take any second guesses. So we read here in the 3rd chapter that Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Now, I don't know whether it was a frame that was overlaid with gold or not, but nevertheless, he made an image of gold whose height was 70 cubits. Now, 70 cubits, if you'll remember, a cubit is about the distance from the tip of my finger to my elbow around here somewhere, something about 18 inches. So he made this thing 70 cubits high, which meant that it was about 90 feet high. Pretty good size image, wasn't it? Pretty easy to see. And the breadth of it, the width of it, was 6. So it was about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Long, tall, and thin. And he set it upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, one of the things he did this for was in order to bring people not unwilling subjection to him, but under bondage, to bring them to bow down to this image and cause them that at whatever time they heard any kind of music. Now, you can read this in verse 2, or verse 3. No, let's go on down, verse 5. I'll get to it in a minute. He called all of his princes, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase some of this. We'll read parts of it. He called them to the dedication of it, and he told them what he had done. And then he said, he had a herald cry aloud in verse 4, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at whatever time, that is, at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up." Now, this was the command that they had to follow. There was no choice in it. They had to fall down, and in those days, it was prostrate on your stomach with your hands stretched out in front of this image. Or if you were not inside of the image, you had to stretch out toward the image in total submission, total humility, and subjection to the will of Nebuchadnezzar the tyrant or Nebuchadnezzar the king, whichever way you want to look at him. And he said, if you don't do it, in the 6th verse, "Whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. In other words, you're going to be destroyed by fire. Therefore, at the time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet and all, I'm not going to read this again, but they have found all kinds of music, all of the people, the nations and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar the king. And everything is fine, supposedly. Except there's 3 rabble-rousers out here that said, no, we're not going to fall down before that fire, golden image. We're not going to submit to the will of Nebuchadnezzar. We're not going to turn our backs on our own God. And we're not going to worship an image, because God has said that we're to have no graven images before us, and we're to worship no other gods before Him. And you know, every time that men are willing to stand before God, there are always those that are going to bring the news to Nebuchadnezzar. There's someone that's going to, I guess you'd say, snitch on them. And this is what happened. There were those that certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews in verse 8. And they told King Nebuchadnezzar, and they always said, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. This was a standard greeting to him. It said, Thou hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music should fall down and worship the image. And whoso falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then they said, There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the people. Now notice, these Chaldeans not only wanted to report the things that the 3 men had refused to do, but they were jealous because these 3 men had found favor in Nebuchadnezzar's sight and had been set over some of the responsibilities of the kingdom. They had certain responsibilities set over the affair of the province of Babylon. These were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he says, These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now you can imagine the wrath in Nebuchadnezzar at that time. Here he had made a decree throughout all of the land, and of all of the hundreds of thousands or millions of people in that kingdom, only 3, as far as the record is concerned. Only 3 refused to fall down and bow before and worship the golden image, according to the law that Nebuchadnezzar laid down. And his rage and fury was unbounded, just unbounded. And he commanded them to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to him. And this is what he said. He asked the question of them in verse 14, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not you serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now they didn't say anything yet. But then he goes on, he says, Now if you'll be ready at time that you hear all of this kinds of music, you fall down and worship him, then that's fine. I'll forgive you because that you didn't do it the first time. We'll just overlook that. We'll let that go. If now you hear music again and you fall down and worship this golden image, then I'll overlook the first time. But he said, If you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And then he says, Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hand? You know, it's an interesting thing. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar was probably one of the most powerful kings that ever lived back in that particular era of time. Probably had more riches, more armies, and probably one of the most powerful armies that they've ever known at that time. Here he was, he had all power, and he really didn't know what he was up against. He had not the slightest idea of what he was up against. That here was someone that would deliver these people out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. But how did these people respond? And this is where we want to get to the point of the lesson right here. If there's no other point, it is their response. Did they fade? Did they quake in their boots? Did their knees shake? And did they say, all right, play the music so we can fall down? We're so glad that you're overlooking that first little mistake that we made. Is that the way they responded? No. And beloved, this is the kind of response we need today more and more and more is the same kind of response that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave to Nebuchadnezzar at that time. And we don't have enough of it in our day and age. There has never been enough of it since that time, if you want to get right down to it. Here's the way they responded. First thing they said was, "O Nebuchadnezzar," and they didn't say, "O king, live forever," because they knew he couldn't. You notice that? Like the other people, they said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever." Not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew who lived for an eternity. It was God, not Nebuchadnezzar. But they said, "We are not careful to answer you in this answer thee in this matter." Now, what is he talking about? Does that mean that they're just going to go ahead and put their mouth in gear before they engage their brain and just say anything that comes out? No, that's not what they mean. What they're really saying is, Nebuchadnezzar, there is no question about what we're going to do. We don't have to think about our answer, because there is only one answer. And that is, we're not going to fall down in front of your golden god and worship it. I'm paraphrasing that, but that's basically what they said. We're not going to worship it. He says, but here's what the way they said it. "If it be so, our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king." Now, I left out 3 words. Our God whom we serve. Whom we serve is able to deliver us. Now, God was able to deliver them whether they served him or not. But they were delivered, why? Because they served God, you see. We'll see a little bit later on. Notice the faith and the commitment, and they were totally convicted that God was ready, willing, and able to deliver them out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And so they said this, "But if not," they told him, first of all, our God will deliver us. There's no question about that. We know that's going to happen. They said, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." They were totally committed to the cause of God and following after God. But they told Nebuchadnezzar, "We're not going to fall down and worship that false god which you have set up, because just because you have said it's a god doesn't make it a god." The Caesars back during the Roman days claimed themselves to be gods. But that didn't make them gods, because they're all gone today. They're all dead. And God Almighty that created the universe and his Son still live on high. And his Son's making intercession for us. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew this. They knew that they did not have to submit themselves to Nebuchadnezzar, and that nothing would happen to them. And so, if you thought Nebuchadnezzar was angry before, you should see him now. If you thought he was upset before, you haven't even started to understand the situation. He was full of fury, the record says. And the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, before, they were favored people of his, promoted by him over the affairs of Babylon. They refused to obey what he told them to obey, and he said, "All right," he says, "since you've been so good and you've done so well for me, if you will go ahead and fall down, then I'll just overlook this first time." But now they have told him they're not, first of all, that God can deliver them, and secondly, that they are not going to fall down before the golden image, regardless of whether God can deliver them or not. Can you imagine such impudence from 3 Jews in the kingdom of Babylon? Think of it, and think of the fury and the rage that he must have felt. And so he said, "All right, you've had your chance. That's it. In you go." And he had them bound. He commanded that the heat of the furnace should be heated 7 times more hotter than hot. Now, I don't know how hot that is. I have no idea. The only thing I know is that it was so hot that the soldiers, the strongest soldiers he could find, bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, cast them into the fiery furnace, and the fire destroyed the soldiers. It destroyed the soldiers who cast Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there. And they were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats and outer garments and everything they had was cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And you know, fire can get pretty hot. I've seen some steel, I don't know how hot it has to get to melt steel, but I imagine that it was approaching those kind of temperatures. So that any other flesh or anything else that came in contact with it would be totally and instantly destroyed. And yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were cast into this kind of a situation. Because in verse 22 it says that the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it says, the record says, they fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And then as Nebuchadnezzar watched, he saw them fall down. And then his face became a look of astonishment as he looked into that burning fiery furnace. 3 men were cast in, and as he looked, he saw 4 men walking around. 4 men. Can you imagine the chill that must have come up and down his spine and over him as he thought about that? As he looked, and he knew that only 3 men were cast in, and he knew that it was a kind of fire that men could not survive, and yet he saw 4 men walking around. And the record says the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Christ was with them. God was with them, delivering them from the burning fiery furnace. And then he realized, Nebuchadnezzar realized the kind of a power that he was dealing with. Beloved, we have the same kind of power today working for us. You may not believe it, but it's just as true today as it was in the time of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he asked them to come out, and it's an interesting thing. That as they came forth out of that fire, as the record says in verse 27, that all of these witnesses, the kings, the princes, governors, captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar saw them and called them out of the fire in verse 26. It's an interesting thing. He said, ye servants of the Most High God, when he called them forth. He recognized, he confessed that there was a God. You see. Right there, he realized that he was up against the creator of this universe. And in verse 27, he says, their fire had no power over their bodies, neither was a hair of their head singed. Neither were their coats changed, and here is what's more important. It was as if they had never been in there, because they didn't even have the smell of smoke or fire upon them. See, it's as if the fire had not even been. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a house fire or been around where a fire like that. I've been a volunteer fireman out in California many years ago, and I'll guarantee you I never went to fire yet that didn't coming back smell like smoke. It just wasn't possible to get near a fire in fighting it, get close enough to fight it, and not smell of smoke when you came away from it. And yet here was a fire that these people were not only close to, they were in it. And you couldn't even smell it. Don't you know that Nebuchadnezzar must have trembled in his boots? But it was all done to the glory of God because of the commitment of these 3 men. Because of their dedication to serving God. Back over there it says, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. They knew in whom they believed, and they were persuaded that he was able to keep them against that which they'd committed unto him. And they committed their lives to him. Beloved, can't we see today so much more if we commit our lives to Christ, how much more much greater it's going to be in an eternity? We need to understand that. And then going on over into the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel, we find a man by the name of Daniel who, here we're in the same kingdom. Things have changed. But now the king's name is Darius, or Darius, some people call him. I say Darius. He appointed 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, and he was the chief president, or the first president. He was in charge of the others, in other words. It says, this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. He was a good man. He was a God-fearing man. He served God. He prayed to God continually. And just as it is every time there's a man that's godly, that is, I guess you could say, getting up in the world, and as it was in the case of Daniel, there are those who are jealous. There are those who, because of their connection with the devil, are trying to do what they can to bring him down. And so they got together in verse 5 and said, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of God. This man was perfect so far as the law of the world was concerned. They had to find something in connection with his God that would go against that and cause him to fall out of favor with King Darius. And so they decided to make a pact where that King Darius would make a decree that anyone who wanted anything, it didn't make any difference what it was, would not ask of anybody else anything except King Darius himself. And if they did, they would be cast into the lion's den and be eaten by the lions. They came in verse 7 and asked Darius to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king. Now, you might say, well, gee whiz, just for 30 days, why not forever? Well, they didn't need forever. All they needed was one day, really. Because they knew what Daniel was going to do. We'll see in a few moments. All they needed was one day, but they said, well, we'll cover it. We'll make it for 30 days. Said, anyone that asks of anything else save of thee, O king, for 30 days, shall be cast into the den of lions. In other words, destroyed. And they conned, and that's really the word for it, they conned King Darius into signing this writing in the decree, because they knew the habits of Daniel. They knew what Daniel did every day. Not only once, but 3 times a day he did it. Because in verse 10 we find it says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went to his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. And get this, as he did aforetime. In other words, according to the way he'd been doing it every day of his life. He didn't change his ways because the decree had been made and signed. He was making his petition with God, and he knelt before the windows toward Jerusalem 3 times a day. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't go into a closet. He stood up for what he believed in God. He was committed and dedicated to the service of God. And then, and these men knew that. They knew it would only take one day. They assembled and they made the accusation to him. He was taken before the king, and everybody knows the story, that he was cast into the lion's den. Now, when King Darius heard that it was Daniel that had made the petition or had prayed and had violated his decree, he was upset. He wasn't mad at Daniel, because he knew what Daniel was doing. He knew that Daniel was not usurping the king's authority, but was seeking help from a greater than this earthly kingdom. And so he was not upset or mad at him, but he was upset that he had to carry out the decree. He was appalled because he had to cast Daniel into the lion's den. But we find that these people persuaded him and said, you can't change your decree. Apparently it was a custom that once the king in those days made a decree, it was unchangeable. This thing had to be enforced for 30 full days. And so the king had him cast into the lion's den, and we find how it affected the king. He went to his palace. He passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. And he fasted all night because he was concerned about his friend Daniel. You see, Daniel was the king's friend. He wasn't his enemy. He was concerned about him. And the very first light in the morning that he could, he rose early and he went to the den of the lions, and he came up to it and he said, "O Daniel, servant of the Most High, or the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions?" Notice the similarity between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. They said, "Our God whom we serve." Darius said, "Is thou God whom thou servest continually?" Both of them had something in common, you see. They were not only committed to God, but they served Him continually. They, as Paul said, prayed without ceasing. And Daniel said unto the king, "O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angels, and hath shut the lion's mouth, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency," boy, I never have been able to say that one, "was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt." And he was exceeding glad. The king was exceedingly glad that Daniel had not been harmed. And of course, what happened to those that had Daniel cast into the lion's den? We find that not only were they destroyed, but their families, their wives, their children, and everything that they had was cast into the lion's den, and they were totally and utterly destroyed for the deceit and for the wickedness that they had committed upon Daniel, and caused the king, had deceived the king into committing. And so then Darius made a decree, another decree. But in this one he said that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. You see what happened, the similarity between the two cases. Nebuchadnezzar was against God. Now, the record doesn't indicate that Darius was, but nevertheless, both in the end, they admitted and confessed to the living God, you see. And that's what's so wonderful about these two stories, the commitment of these men, the dedication to them, and the fact that they were saved and delivered because they served God continually. Beloved, as we think about our lives and the time to come and the times of our lives to come, we need to be concerned about how we serve God and how committed we are or are not to God. Because there's a much greater salvation coming to us than there was to Daniel. You know, Daniel could have been destroyed in the lion's den and still walked with God. See, because he served God continually. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have been destroyed in the fiery furnace and still walked with God for an eternity.